They tell you the job is simple. Relay maintenance. Buoy work. You sit in a tin can at the edge of surveyed space. You make sure the signal keeps moving, and every 18 months a supply shuttle comes to remind you that other human beings exist. The pay is extraordinary because nobody else will do it. The psych screening is the most thorough in the service because they need to know you won't come apart at the seams when the loneliness gets serious. I passed the screening 4 times. 4 tour. 72 months total spread across 8 years, every one of them in the outer relay lanes, most of them alone. My file said I was ideally suited to extended solo deployment. Stable. Low affect. High task persistence. The evaluator who wrote that probably meant it as a compliment. I thought about that file a lot afterward. I thought about what it said about me, that I was better at being alone than most people could manage. I thought about what it cost to become that kind of man. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stories have a geography, and this one starts at Kilo 7. Relay Station Kilo 7 sat in a lazy orbit around a moon nobody had named yet. Designation DM441 Bravo, listed in the survey catalog as non-habitable, non-resource viable, and marginally interesting from a geological standpoint. Roughly the size of Earth's moon. Gray-brown from orbit, no atmosphere worth measuring, surface pocked with the standard scarring you get on any old rock that's been out here since the system cooled. The kind of moon you'd fly past without blinking if you were headed somewhere interesting. I wasn't headed anywhere. Kilo 7 was my world. Had been for 16 months by the time this story begins, and was scheduled to be my world for 2 more. The station was a glorified antenna with a HAB module bolted to it. 3 rooms if you counted the head. 1 window worth calling a window. And a signal array that needed manual calibration every 72 hours because the relay lane it served was one of the older stretches in this sector. And the hardware had been patched together over decades by people with different ideas about how to solve the same problems. I was good at the work. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't suffering out there. I'd built my routines with the same care a craftsman puts into a good tool: wake, check, calibrate, eat, exercise, read, sleep, repeat. I had books, more than I'd ever finish. I had recordings of my sister's kids that I watched when the dark got heavy. I had a small thermos I'd carried since my first tour, dented on the left side from a fall I took on a transit shuttle in my 2nd year, and every time I filled it, I held it in both hands for a moment before I drank. Small things. You learn out there that small things are all that stand between you and the part of your own mind you don't want to look at. The moon was 212 kilometers below me. I'd stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing the wall across from your desk. Background, furniture, part of the fixed landscape of a routine that didn't change. Then on the 409th day of my tour, it changed. I was running the standard pre-calibration sweep when the passive sensor board flagged an anomaly. Not a transmission, nothing structured enough to be a transmission. More like interference, but interference with a quality I'd never seen in 16 months of looking at the same stretch of space. It had a rhythm, not regular enough to be mechanical, not random enough to be natural. I stared at the readout for a long time. Then I logged it, marked it for the weekly report, and went back to the calibration sequence. That night, I dreamed about my father. This wouldn't be remarkable except that my father had been dead for 11 years, and I had not dreamed of him once in all that time. Not once. I'd noticed the absence, the way you notice a scar that stopped aching. Something was gone that used to hurt, and the not hurting had its own shape. Grief that's done its work leaves a clean edge. His face in the dream was exactly as I remembered it from before the illness took him down to someone smaller. Strong jaw, the gray at his temples that came in when I was 12, the particular way he held his coffee cup with both hands. He was standing in the kitchen of the house where I grew up, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized. Not happy, not sad. Waiting. The way a man waits when he has something important to say and he's giving you the room to ask first. I woke with my heart hitting the inside of my chest like it had somewhere urgent to be. I lay in the dark for a while, listening to the station breathe, and then I got up and checked the sensor board again. The rhythm was still there, slower now, like something settling in for the night. I logged it again and went back to sleep, but I didn't dream of anything after that. Just the dark behind my eyes and the sounds of the station, and somewhere below, 212 kilometers of nothing between me and a moon that nobody had bothered to name. The second night, I dreamed about a woman named Carla Santos. Carla had been my partner in my third year of relay work briefly, before she transferred to an inter-system post. We'd been something more than colleagues and less than what either of us had wanted, in the way that people get when they're both too careful to push for the real thing. She'd sent me a message 6 years ago, a short one, to say she'd gotten married. I'd sent back 3 lines of congratulations that I spent an hour writing. Her face in the dream was the one I remembered from a photograph she'd sent me once, taken on a coastal station somewhere in the outer belt, laughing at something off camera, the vacuum gray of space framed behind her through a thick porthole, her hair loose in the low G. She was sitting across from me at a table I didn't recognize in a room I'd never been in, and she was trying to tell me something. Her mouth was moving. I couldn't hear the words. The harder I concentrated, the further away she seemed, and then I woke again with the same hard-hammering chest and the same silence in the station. I sat on the edge of my bunk and breathed deliberately, the way they teach you in psych orientation, and I thought about what the anomaly on the sensor board might be. I thought about geological emissions, piezoelectric effects from compressed crystalline structures in the moon's upper crust, maybe. I thought about resonance artifacts from the relay array itself, some interaction between the antenna hardware and a mineral composition in the rock below that no one had thought to check. I thought about 6 rational explanations, and I held all of them in my head while the breathing technique brought my pulse down, and none of them felt right. On the third day, I accessed the station's media archive and ran the standard recreational protocol. The protocol was a holdover from the early relay days when the psych team worried that operators working alone would fall into fixed patterns of behavior and stop engaging with anything outside their task set. It pulled a random selection from a library of preloaded content, short films, recorded performances, documentary segments, and presented them in a playlist. The idea was variety, small nudges to keep the mind moving. The first item in that day's playlist was a calibration recording. Standard thing, a technician running a visual checklist, plain background, no audio, meant to be used for screen alignment checks. Nothing in it worth looking at. I was half paying attention, eating my midday meal, when the face on the screen stopped me cold. He was in the background. Not the technician, someone standing behind her off to the left, partly occluded by a piece of equipment, just standing there. He was only on screen for 4 seconds before the camera angle shifted. 4 seconds. It was my father. Not someone who looked like my father. Not a resemblance that my tired, isolated brain had inflated into a false recognition. My father. The jaw, the gray at the temples, the way he held his weight. The particular stillness of a man who has lived long enough to have no need for movement when there's no movement required. I put down my meal and watched those 4 seconds 11 times. He was there. He was in a recording made before I deployed. The timestamp in the file metadata put its creation date 4 years ago, before my father died. And he was standing in the background of a calibration recording with the specific stillness of a man who knew he was being watched and was waiting for me to notice. I closed the file and sat in the silence of the station for a long time. Then I opened a channel to the nearest relay hub, 14 light minutes away, and I sent a terse request for early rotation. Personal reasons. I did not explain further. The reply came back 28 minutes later. Regret to inform. No rotation available for current cycle. Earliest resupply opportunity remained 6 weeks out. A notation that psychological support resources were available through the relay network if needed, and a list of access codes. I read it twice, I archived it, I went back to the sensor board. The rhythm from the moon had changed again. It was faster now, more complex. I watched it for an hour and recognized something I hadn't wanted to name before. It was responsive. It was not a static emission cycling through some fixed geological process. It changed when I engaged with it. It was paying attention. I want to be careful here about the order in which I arrived at certain conclusions, because the order matters. I didn't decide what was happening and then look for evidence. I looked at what was in front of me and let the conclusion find its own shape. First, something in or beneath the surface of DM441 Bravo was emitting structured, rhythmic signals. Second, those signals were responsive to human observation. They changed in character when I monitored them and returned to a baseline state when I did not. Third, the signals had begun at the same time that my dreams changed in character. Dreams that produced with high fidelity memories I had either suppressed, lost, or, in the case of the calibration recording, never consciously possessed. I sat with those 3 facts for a long time. What I am about to describe next is the part that's hardest to make clear to anyone who wasn't there. Not because it was violent, or because it was dramatic in the way that stories about aliens tend to be dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was quiet, and it was slow, and it undid me in a way that no amount of violence could have managed, because what it went after wasn't my body. It went after what I was. Over the next 11 days, I lost myself in pieces. It started with the small things. I would sit down to my routine calibration and realize, partway through, that I couldn't remember the second step of the sequence. Not because I was tired or distracted, because it was gone. A procedure I had performed 142 times in 16 months was simply not in me anymore. I'd find it again, eventually. It was in the manual, it was in my logs, it would reassemble itself after an hour of concentration. But the immediate access, the muscle memory depth of it, had been stripped out and left a smooth absence. Then it was larger things. I went to make a note in my personal log and couldn't remember what year I'd started relay work. I knew the number, I could perform the arithmetic if I thought about it, but the memory of sitting in the orientation office with the contract in my hand, and the recruiter explaining the terms, that specific memory, was gone. I knew it had happened. I had no image of it. Then one morning I woke up, and I couldn't remember my sister's name. I knew she existed. I could picture her face. I could see the recording of her children that I watched sometimes in the long evenings. I could feel the exact shape of the affection I had for her, the specific weight of it, 38 years of shared history compressed into an emotion my chest recognized completely. And her name was gone. I found it eventually. It was in my personal documents, emergency contact form, her name printed clearly. Elena. I said it out loud 3 times, holding the form in both hands, and I cried, which I had not done since my father's funeral. I want you to understand what was happening. This was not a malfunction of my nervous system. I was not ill. My cognitive scores on the daily self-assessment tests showed normal function across every measurable domain. What was being taken was selective, specific. It was the things I knew because I had lived them, the proprioceptive knowledge of experience, the weight and texture of a life that had actually happened. Those were going. The data remained. The documentation remained. But the living truth of the memories, the part that made them mine, was being extracted with a precision that no surgical instrument I'd ever heard of could have managed. On the 7th day, I ran the self-assessment battery and came up normal. That was the worst part in some ways, the gap between what the instrument said and what I knew, cognitively functional, emotionally stable within rated parameters, task performance within operational standards. Everything the system could measure said I was fine, and the system had no instrument for measuring the texture of a life. It had no metric for the weight of a specific afternoon in a specific kitchen with a specific man who'd been dead for 11 years. It could not quantify what it meant to know that a memory had existed and find only the shape of the space where it had been. I thought about the other relay operators I'd known. 12, over 8 years of tour, the ones I'd overlapped with at changeover, or communicated with across the relay lanes during the long, quiet watches. I thought about whether any of them had been through something like this, whether there were other moons, other signals, other rhythms that had gone unclassified in quarterly reports. Whether someone had come back from a solo tour quieter than they'd left, and nobody had asked the right questions, because the scores looked normal and the work had been done. I thought about a tech named Gareth Mule who'd done 4 consecutive tours in the outer Crestville sector, and come back on the last one so changed that command had flagged his rotation for psychological review. He'd cleared the review. The evaluators had noted mild dissociative symptoms consistent with extended isolation and cleared him for lighter duty in the inner system. He was doing maintenance work on an orbital platform somewhere. I'd heard that through the relay network grapevine. I hadn't thought about it in years. I thought about it now. I started writing things down, everything I could. Fast, in longhand, in the margins of every document I could find, the names of everyone I had ever cared about, the specific details of specific moments, the smell of my childhood home, the sound of my father's voice when he laughed. I wrote until my hand hurt, and then I kept writing. I covered both sides of every sheet of maintenance paper in the station. I went through the entire physical log archive and annotated the margins. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough even as I was doing it, because the act of writing relied on the memories I was trying to preserve. I could only write what was still accessible, which meant the things already gone were invisible to me, and I couldn't write what I didn't know I'd lost. I was patching a hull by feeling for the holes in the dark, and every patch I put down, the hull kept breathing. But I kept writing, because stopping felt like surrender. And the one thing I had left with certainty was that I was not the kind of man who surrendered to something he couldn't see. I'd been that kind of man for a long time before I knew it. I want to be honest about where it came from, because it didn't come from discipline or training. It came from my father, who had worked a job he didn't love for 30 years because he had a family to feed and didn't believe in leaving things undone, and who had never once said anything about it except through the specific quality of his silence on Sunday mornings when the week was over and the next one hadn't started yet. A silence that held everything, the weight of what it cost, the choice not to perform the cost, the refusal to make other people carry what was his to carry. I had learned to be that kind of man by watching him be that kind of man for all of the years I was watching. When I couldn't remember Alina's name, I couldn't remember where that stubbornness came from either. That was the moment it felt like dying, not the specific loss of her name, but the cascade effect. The thing in the moon hadn't just taken a name. It had taken the architecture of a value. Without Alina, I didn't have the memory of learning to carry things for the people who depend on you. And without that, I didn't have the full understanding of why my father's silence on Sunday mornings meant what it meant. And without that, I didn't have the complete version of the specific stubbornness that was keeping me at the console instead of crawling into my bunk and letting the gaps take whatever they wanted. That was when I understood it wasn't just eating memories. It was eating the connections between them, the load-bearing joints, the specific articulations that made a life coherent rather than just a collection of events. On the 9th day, I looked at the sensor board, and the rhythm from the moon was the most complex I had ever seen it. Dense and layered, cycling through variations I could no longer track. I thought about the thing down there. Whatever it was, whatever form it took, whether it was a single organism or a distributed intelligence or something so different from either concept that neither word applied, I thought about what it was doing and what it wanted. It was eating me. That's the simplest way I know to put it. Not my tissue, not my chemistry, my experience, myself in the deep sense, the thing that makes a person not just a processing unit but the specific history of a specific life. It was taking that, extracting it with whatever mechanism those rhythmic signals represented, and I didn't know why, and I didn't know if it was capable of stopping, and I didn't know, at that point, how much of me was left. The 10th day, something happened that I hadn't expected. I was sitting at the console at maybe 2 in the morning, too tired to sleep, adding to my written record, and I picked up the Thermos. The dented one. The one I'd carried since my first tour. And I remembered. Not retrieved from documentation. Not reconstructed from facts I'd preserved in my margin notes. Remembered the way you remember things you haven't thought about in years, a full sensory arrival, the whole thing at once. The transit shuttle, the turbulence that knocked me sideways in the aisle. The sound of the impact, the Thermos bouncing off the deck plate, the passenger across from me, a retired mining engineer named Vasquez, on his way out for one last survey contract, grabbing it before it rolled under the seat and handing it back to me with 2 fingers and a nod. The economy of motion of a man who'd spent decades in space and wasted nothing. I hadn't thought about Vasquez in years. He wasn't in any of my documents. He wasn't in my emergency contacts or my correspondence archive or any of the margin notes I'd been writing. He was just a man I'd sat across from on a shuttle for 4 hours, 22 years ago, who'd handed me a Thermos. And he was there, completely there. The gray of his coveralls, the particular smell of transit shuttle recycled air, the vibration of the hull under my boots, all of it. I held the Thermos, and I understood something. The thing in the moon was real, and it was powerful, and it had been systematically dismantling me for 10 days. But it had a limit. It could reach the memories I carried in my mind, the neural record, whatever biochemical architecture the brain uses to store and retrieve experience. It could reach that. It had been reaching it with stunning efficiency. But it could not reach the memories I carried in the world. The dent in the Thermos was a memory, not a metaphor, literally. The physical fact of the dent encoded a moment as surely as any neural pathway. When I touched it, the moment came back not through my brain alone, but through my hands, through the specific weight and temperature of the object, through a channel the thing in the moon apparently couldn't access or hadn't thought to account for. I sat with that for a long moment. I turned the Thermos over in both hands the way you turn a problem, looking for the angle that makes it solvable. The thing in the moon was old. I didn't know how old, but the quality of what it had done felt ancient. The way a tool worn smooth by long use has a different weight than a new one. It had been doing this to mines for a long time. It had optimized, refined, developed precision. It knew what it was going after, and it knew how to get there. But it had been doing it, presumably, to mines that worked the way it expected mines to work. Internal storage, bounded architecture, the experience of a life contained within the organism that lived it. Every cognitive system it had ever encountered had probably followed that pattern, because that pattern is intuitive. It's how it makes sense for a mind to be organized. Inside the body, behind the eyes, inaccessible from outside without direct neural interface. We don't work like that. We never have. Every other species in the contact registry stores themselves inside. We store ourselves everywhere we've ever been. I looked around the station with new eyes. The maintenance manual with its yellowed index tabs, each tab placed on a day I could no longer fully remember but which my fingers found without hesitation. The particular way I'd arranged the supply lockers, not according to the standard schematic, but according to a system I'd developed over months, an arrangement my body navigated without thought. The calluses on my palms from the calibration panels, rough-edged toggle switches. The groove worn into the edge of the console, where I rested my left elbow during long watches. Everywhere I looked I saw memory, not in my head, in the world, encoded in objects, habits, physical traces. The texture of a life actually lived, pressed into matter, indelible in a way that no signal from below could touch. I started working, I went through the station methodically, object by object, surface by surface, and I held each thing and I let whatever came back come back. Some of it was small, a remembered conversation, a smell, a face. Some of it hit me hard enough that I had to sit down and let it move through me before I could continue. I cried 4 separate times. I didn't stop for either. There was a wrench in the tool locker that I had borrowed from a tech named Fuad during changeover at an earlier posting, borrowed and not returned, because he'd pressed it into my hand when I was in a rush and said to keep it. He had 3 more. I hadn't thought about Fuad in years. When I picked up the wrench, he came back in full. A short man with a careful handshake and the habit of quoting proverbs under his breath when the work got complicated, who had taught me, over 2 weeks of shared posting, that the best tool maintenance was the maintenance you did before anything broke. That the work you did in the quiet hours was the only reason you had options in the hard ones. I stood in the tool locker and held the wrench, and I thought about how many quiet hours I'd put into this station, maintaining what I'd been given, and I thought, I have options. I have more options than the thing below me knows. It reached for the architecture and found a building. But I am also the soil the building stands on. I am also the neighborhood, the city, the whole long road that led here. There was a paperback novel I'd carried for 2 tours without reading, because it had been pressed on me by a man at a resupply port who'd said it was the best thing written in the past 50 years about what it means to survive. I'd meant to read it at the next quiet stretch and never had. The cover was creased, and the spine was cracked from being carried in a kit bag. I held it, and I remembered the man's face, and his certainty, and the way he'd looked at me like he was handing me something that mattered. I didn't remember his name, but I remembered the weight of his conviction, and that came back through my hands when I held the book, and it steadied me. There was a set of calibration notes in my handwriting, from early in this tour, covering a sequence I'd had to troubleshoot for 6 hours on a bad day in my 3rd month. I'd annotated them heavily, not just the solution but the wrong turns, the things I'd tried that hadn't worked, the moment when I'd finally seen what I was missing. When I held those notes and read them, I remembered the 6 hours. The frustration of it, and then the clarity, and then the specific satisfaction of a problem solved by patience rather than luck. I remembered that I was good at this work, that I had chosen it and stayed in it because it suited me, and that even here, even in this, I was still the man who could work a problem until it yielded. My father I found in the coffee mug I'd brought from home. He'd bought it for me at a machine shop supply store before my first tour, said a man doing real work ought to have a real cup, not the pressed polymer disposables the service issued. Plain white, chip on the rim, heavy enough to have heft in the hand. When I held it, he came back to me the way he'd been in the dream, except more. The smell of the house, the specific quality of the kitchen light in the mornings, the way he'd sat across from me the night before I left for orientation and said almost nothing but looked at me for a long time, storing me up. Carla Santos I found in a navigation chip she'd given me as a joke on her last day aboard, a custom job, labeled in her handwriting with the coordinates of a planet that didn't exist, which she'd said was where people who were too careful to say what they meant ended up. I'd kept it in my kit for 5 years without letting myself look at it. When I held it now, her laugh came back, and the smell of the station where we'd worked together, and the specific ache of having been too careful. And I held that ache too because it was mine, and it was real, and nothing was going to take it from me. Elena I found in my hands, the muscle memory of carrying her when she was an infant, my first year alive as her brother. I didn't remember deciding to learn how. My mother had simply handed her to me, and I'd figured it out, the way you figure out things that matter. My arms had not forgotten. I worked for 9 hours without stopping. By the time I was done, I was exhausted in a way I'd never been before, not physical exhaustion, something deeper like the exhaustion of surgery, of a body that has been opened and closed again. But I was there, all of me, or near enough. I checked the things that had been taken first. The calibration sequence, my first year in relay work, Elena's name, and found them back. Not perfectly but substantially, stitched together from what the objects had returned to me and what I'd recorded in the margins. Then I opened a channel to the sensor board, and I told the thing in the moon what I'd found. I did this, I want to be clear, not in words. I did it by sitting in front of the passive array and beginning, methodically, to document the station, every object with its provenance, every wear pattern with its history. I spoke it all aloud into the open channel, not because I believed it would understand language, but because I wanted it to know that I knew what it had missed. I wanted the act of knowing to be audible. Whether it understood me or not, I can't say. What I can say is that the rhythm from the moon changed in a way it hadn't changed before. It slowed. It simplified. It returned, over the course of about an hour, to the low-frequency baseline I'd first detected on that initial night. And then it went quiet. Not off. I could still detect it if I ran the passive array at maximum sensitivity, but it had reduced to something barely distinguishable from background. Withdrawn, maybe, or resting, or finished. I didn't know then, and I still don't know now, what the thing in the moon was, what it needed the memories for, whether it had gotten what it came for, or whether I'd interrupted something it would have continued. I had 9 weeks of sensor data and no framework to interpret most of it. I still don't. What I know is that, for the remaining 47 days of my tour, it left me alone. I kept writing. I wrote in the margins of every document in the station, and then I started writing in my own logs, long entries, more detailed than anything I'd put in a personal record before. Not because the thing in the moon was still threatening me, because I understood something I hadn't before. Memory is not a record. I want to be precise about this because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it since. A record is static. You can retrieve it, but you can't revise it and you can't add to it, and it doesn't change the way you stand in the world. Memory is different. Memory is load-bearing. It's the architecture a person lives inside, and when you pull too much of it out, the structure doesn't collapse dramatically, it sags. You keep functioning. Your cognitive scores stay normal. But you lose the specific gravity that keeps a person tethered to the things that matter. And you don't know you've lost it until you're standing in a station 212 kilometers above an anonymous moon, and you can't remember your sister's name. The thing in the moon knew how to reach the architecture. It didn't know about the walls. I've thought about that a lot. Whatever it was, however intelligent, however sophisticated its method of extraction, it had been designed by its own nature to operate on a kind of storage it recognized. Internal. Neurological. The things we carry inside. It had no model for the way human beings externalize themselves, press their experience into the physical world, build their identity into objects and habits and worn edges and muscle memory accumulated over decades of living in matter. The other registered intelligent species in the contact registry, the 3 we'd confirmed by the time of my tour, the 2 we suspected, none of them do this the way we do. The Vorath hold memory in collective resonance. The Geed carry it chemically, passed forward at reproduction. The Suler, from what little we know, encoded in spatial relationships, the precise arrangement of their built environments, all internal to their species architecture. All, in principle, extractable by something that knew how to reach the right channel. We make coffee cups from our fathers. We keep navigational chips from women we were too careful with. We develop calluses on the sides of our hands that remember 1,000 calibration sequences. We are the only ones who do this, as far as I know, who leak ourselves so thoroughly into the world around us that who we are extends through everything we've touched. The thing in the moon ran into that and didn't know what to do with it. There's a particular satisfaction in surprising something that thought it understood you. I want to be honest about that. I sat in the quiet of the station in those last weeks and I let myself feel it, that cold, specific satisfaction, and I didn't apologize for it. The resupply shuttle arrived on day 467. Pilot named Okonkwo, compact and efficient, ran the standard resupply sequence with the minimum of conversation and the maximum of professional courtesy. When she handed me the duty manifest to sign off, She looked at me for a moment with the practiced eye of someone who has resupplied isolation postings for long enough to know what they do to people, and she said, simply, "You good?" I thought about how to answer that. "Getting there," I said. She nodded. That answer satisfied her in a way that yes wouldn't have, because she'd worked long enough to know that yes from someone who'd been alone that long was worth nothing, but getting there meant the person could still tell the difference. I was the only passenger. The ride back to the inner system took 6 weeks. I spent them doing something I'd never done on a return transit before. I wrote. Not logs, not reports. Memory. Everything I could recover from those 9 weeks, and everything the objects had given back to me, put down in full, in order, with the weight and texture of it intact. I filled 4 handwritten notebooks the station stores had nothing to do with otherwise. I wrote about my father. I wrote about the kitchen in the house where I grew up and the particular quality of the light in winter, and the sound of the radio he kept on low in the mornings, tuned to a station that played music from before I was born. I wrote about the last conversation we'd had before his illness made conversation difficult, which was not about anything important. A dispute about a tool he'd lent me that I'd returned damaged, both of us too stubborn to say what we meant, which was that we were going to miss each other when the time came and neither of us knew how to say it. I wrote that down. The argument and the thing underneath the argument. Both of it mine. I wrote about Alina, about the particular way she'd called me when our father was in his last month, her voice doing the thing it did when she was being strong for someone else and it was costing her. About my nephew's drawings that she sent me at postings, crayon bright and specific. The transmitter array I worked at rendered in an 8-year-old's hand with careful attention to the wrong details, the antenna legs too thick, and the hab module too large and a sun in the corner, even though there was no sun visible from my station. I wrote about how I'd put that drawing up on the console wall with a strip of adhesive and looked at it during the calibrations, and how it had made the work feel connected to something. I wrote about Carla Santos, not the careful version, not the version I told myself in which it was both our faults equally, and the timing was wrong, and it was all very adult and nobody bled. The real version. The one where I'd known what I wanted and hadn't said it because saying it made it possible to lose it, and where she'd eventually stopped waiting and found someone who wasn't operating from that particular fear. I wrote that down too, because it was mine whether I was proud of it or not, and the thing in the moon had tried to take it, and I was not going to let anything take it. The act of writing it was the act of insisting it had happened, insisting I had been there. Insisting I was the man who had lived those specific moments with those specific people, and that no signal from an anonymous moon 212 kilometers below a relay station could change that. Okonkwo, to her credit, left me entirely alone and kept the coffee coming. I've been asked in the years since whether I reported what happened at Kilo 7. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that I reported it in terms that the Survey Service's hazard assessment process was not quite equipped to handle. There's a framework for biological threats, for weapon systems, for anomalous radiation and chemical hazards. There's a framework for xenobiology in general, with an emphasis on the kinds of xenobiology that can be detected with standard instrumentation. There's no framework for an intelligence that attacks your memory. They listened carefully. They assigned a review team. The review team spent 14 months conducting remote sensor surveys of DM-441 Bravo and found the same anomalous rhythmic emissions I detected, unchanged in fundamental character. They filed a hazard classification of unknown tier. They flagged the moon for inhabited station restriction, which means no solo deployment within 200 kilometers of the surface without specific protocol clearance. I was consulted in the development of the new protocol. I spent a long time on that consultation, and I was, if I'm honest, difficult to work with. Not because I was bitter or damaged, though I was both for a while. Because the people developing the protocol kept looking for the thing the moon did and trying to find a way to block it. Shielding, countermeasures, signal interference. Their instinct was entirely understandable. Identify the vector, neutralize the vector. I told them the countermeasure they needed wasn't technical. They asked me to be more specific. I was. Standard relay postings at that time had minimal personalization protocols. The thinking was that personalization increased the difficulty of transfers and could compromise operational readiness. An operator too attached to their station's specific layout might be slower to adapt to a new posting. Practical logic. Not wrong, exactly. Just operating from a model of the human operator as a processing unit rather than as a person, which is a fine distinction until it suddenly isn't. What I recommended was this. Every operator in a solo relay posting should be required to bring personal objects. Not allowed, required. Photographs, family items, tools with histories, anything that encoded significant memory in physical form. They should be required to maintain a physical record of significant personal experiences, separate from the operational log. They should spend a portion of each day in deliberate contact with those objects, not as a therapeutic exercise but as a maintenance procedure. Memory maintenance. Keep the walls in good repair. The board approved the recommendation after 8 months of discussion. It is now standard protocol for all solo deep field deployment, and the reasoning in the documentation is somewhat sanitized. It's framed primarily in terms of psychological health maintenance, which is accurate as far as it goes, but doesn't capture the specific threat model I had in mind. I've made my peace with that. The practical effect is the same. There have been 3 subsequent deployments to the Kilo 7 sector, under the new protocol, with expanded crew sizes and the personalization requirement strictly enforced. All 3 returned without incident. One crew reported unusual dream activity in the vicinity of DM 441 Bravo, but nothing beyond that. The thing in the moon appears to have concluded, at some point, that we were not worth the effort. I've thought about why. My best guess, and it is only that, a guess made by a relay tech with a lot of time to think and no xenobiological training whatsoever, is that the thing in the moon fed on memory the way some organisms feed on energy, and that what attracted it to human operators specifically was the richness of what we carry, the density of it. The way a single human life accumulates, over decades, a complex interlocking record of experience that no other species in the contact registry apparently generates in quite the same form. We're interesting to things that eat what we are. That's not a comfortable conclusion. I've sat with it for years now, and it hasn't gotten more comfortable. But here's the other side of that. What makes us interesting also makes us indigestible. We store too much in too many places. We externalize ourselves so thoroughly, press our experience into so many objects and surfaces and habits and bodies that you cannot get all of it from the inside. The redundancy that looks from certain angles like sentimentality, the kept objects, the inherited tools, the coffee cups from dead fathers, that redundancy is structural. It's load-bearing. Pull the neural record and you've only got half the building. The rest is still standing in the walls. The thing in the moon learned that about us, I think, eventually. My father's coffee cup is on my desk as I write this. It still has the chip in the rim. I still use it every morning, and every morning I hold it for a moment before I drink, and he is there, not perfectly, not completely, but in the way that the people we've loved are always there when we make room for them, in the specific weight of the things they gave us and the habits that formed around those things and the slow accretion of a life that knew them. I retired from relay work 2 years after Kilo 7, not because of what happened, or not only because of that. I'd done the math on how much of my life I'd spent at the edge of the surveyed space and decided I was owed some interior territory. I have a post now that keeps me in the inner system, routine work, nothing that requires the kind of sustained solitude I was apparently so suited for. I still have the Thermos, the dent on the left side from the shuttle floor, from the quick hands of a mining engineer I knew for 4 hours and never saw again. I still have the navigation chip. I still can't quite decide what to do about Carla, and I suspect I never will, and I've made a kind of peace with that too. The thing in the moon is still there. The survey service checks in on it annually with a remote probe, and every year the rhythm is there at baseline, quiet, cycling through its deep, slow pattern. Whatever it learned from me, whatever use it made of what it took, it has kept. The memories I lost in those 11 days never came back completely. There are gaps. Some of them I can feel the shape of, I know something was there, can almost see the outline of it, the way you can see the shape of a piece of furniture in the impression it left in the carpet. Others I don't know are gone at all, which is the stranger thing to live with. I am not the same man who went out to Kilo 7. I want to be precise about that. Not worse. Not damaged beyond use. Different. Stripped of some things and given back others and changed, in the way that real encounters with what is genuinely alien always change the people who survive them. What I know now that I didn't know going in is this. The most dangerous thing out there is not the thing that wants to kill you. It's the thing that wants to understand you badly enough to take you apart to do it. And the best defense against that is not armor or weapons or signal countermeasures. It's being so fully yourself, in so many places and forms, that there's no single point from which you can be removed. It's the dent in a thermos. It's a chip in the rim of a cup. It's the particular way your hands know how to hold a child you haven't held in 30 years, because the weight of her was real, and real things stay. That's what we have. That's what we are. And whatever is out there in the dark, cataloging what it can reach and consuming what it finds, it has not yet built a container big enough to hold all of what we insist on being. It tried once, with me, on a moon no one had named, in the quiet of a posting at the edge of surveyed space. It tried. I am still here. The cup is still on my desk. That's enough. There is one more thing I should tell you, because the story doesn't end clean, and I've learned to distrust endings that do. 3 months after I filed my hazard report on DM-441 Bravo, I received a communication from a researcher at the Xenocognition Institute, a woman named Dr. Priya Nambar, who had read the preliminary summary my service had circulated through the contact registry partners. She was polite, careful, exactly the kind of scientist who checks her assumptions before she states them. She wanted to talk through my account of the selective memory loss in detail. We spoke for 4 hours over 2 sessions. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself, and she listened to my answers with the focused stillness of someone who was rearranging a model in real time. At the end of the second session, she told me something that I've turned over in my mind ever since. She said that the contact registry had, at that point, 3 confirmed and 2 probable intelligent species on record. She said that all 5 of those species shared certain broad cognitive characteristics that had been identified by xenopsychology teams across several different research programs, using several different methodological approaches. She said that one of the characteristics they all shared, all 5 confirmed and probable alike, was what she called internally bounded memory architecture. All of them stored experience inside the organism, some neurologically, some chemically, some through other mechanisms. But inside, the boundary of the individual organism was the boundary of its accessible past. She said that when her team reviewed the survey data from DM-441 Bravo and compared it to known xenocognitive profiles, the closest match for the thing in the moon's cognitive architecture was something they'd speculated about theoretically but never expected to encounter: a distributed memory predator. An intelligence that evolved not to generate and store its own experience, but to acquire and integrate the experience of other intelligences. A thing that had no native past of its own, only what it took. She said the implications were significant. If the thing in the moon was what she thought it was, it would have been encountering intelligent species for a very long time. It would have accumulated over its existence a vast and varied collection of the interior lives of other minds. It would have, in a meaningful sense, been built by the things it had consumed. And it had never, as far as the registry data could establish, been successfully resisted before. I sat with that for a long moment. She said the thing that had stopped it wasn't the physical objects per se, though those were the vector. It was the redundancy. The fact that human memory is not bounded by the human organism. We are the only registered species that has leaked our experience into the physical world so thoroughly that removing it from inside us leaves a substantial portion of it intact outside us. Every other species the thing in the moon had encountered was comprehensively contained. We weren't. She said, carefully, that it was possible the thing in the moon had known this, at some level. That it had withdrawn not because it ran out of capacity or interest, but because it recognized, for the first time in however long it had been operating, that it was dealing with something it could not fully ingest. I asked her what she thought it had done with the memories it took. From me and from whoever else it had taken them from over however many centuries it had been sitting under that gray-brown surface. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she didn't know for certain, but her best model was that it integrated them, kept them, built itself out of them, layer by layer, adding each consumed life to whatever accumulated structure constituted its identity. I thought about my father standing in the background of a calibration recording that had been shot before he died. I thought about what it would mean if the thing in the moon had consumed memories from other minds, other species, across other encounters, and was capable of constructing composites from them, of building a face from pieces of other faces, a posture from other postures, and presenting it to the observer in the exact form most likely to provoke a response. I thought about whether my father had ever been in that recording at all, or whether the thing had put him there. I asked Dr. Nambier. She said, again carefully, that she couldn't rule it out. The thing in the moon would have needed access to my memory of my father to construct an accurate representation of him, which meant it had taken that memory first, before I knew anything was happening, and used it to deepen the extraction, a lure built from what it had already stolen. She said this was consistent with an intelligence that had been doing this for a very long time. I thanked her and closed the channel and sat in my apartment in the inner system for a while in the quiet. I want to be honest about what I felt. It would be easier to say I felt afraid or angry or some clean emotion with a clear name. What I felt was more complicated. There was grief in it, the understanding that the image of my father I'd seen in that recording wasn't him, had never been him, was a construction built from stolen material. There was a specific grief to that, a second loss layered on the first. But there was something else too, something that has no better name than respect, the cold kind, the kind you extend to an adversary that has earned it on its merits. It had been doing this, probably, since before any of the known species had developed the cognitive architecture to be worth consuming. It had been gathering minds, layer by layer, building itself from the interior lives of others. It was old in a way that makes the word old meaningless, and in all that time, across all those encounters, it had never run into something like us, had never encountered a species that was so thoroughly itself in so many places and forms that there was no clean extraction, had never had to stop. And then it met a relay technician with a dented thermos and a coffee cup from his dead father, and the handwriting of a woman he'd been too careful with, and it learned what we are. I don't know how to feel about being the species that surprised something like that. I've been trying to figure it out for a long time. Pride seems too small. Relief seems too simple. What I come back to, most often, is something that feels like a statement of fact rather than an emotion. We are not designed for this kind of encounter. We weren't built with the thing in the moon in mind. Nobody sat down and planned a species architecture that would survive a memory predator. The redundancy that saved me wasn't a weapon or a strategy. It was a side effect of being the kind of thing we are, present in the world, permeable to it, incapable of keeping ourselves fully interior. We make marks everywhere we go. We invest ourselves in objects and habits and other people, and the slow physical record of a life actually lived. And we do it not because it's tactically sound, but because we can't help it. It turns out that's a defense, an extraordinary one against the right adversary. Not because it was designed to be, but because we are, in some fundamental sense, too messy to be completely consumed. The messiness is the armor. I think about that a lot. The last thing Dr. Nambair said to me, at the end of our second session, before I thanked her and closed the channel, was that she intended to recommend a systematic review of all outer system relay postings for evidence of similar cognitive interference events. She said the thing at DM 441, Bravo, might not be unique. There might be others in other parts of surveyed space that had been operating without detection because the operators they encountered hadn't had the sensor data I had, or hadn't been paying attention, or hadn't understood what the dreams meant until too much was already gone. I told her I hoped she was wrong. She said she did too, but she didn't think she was. That review is ongoing as far as I know. I haven't been asked to contribute further and I haven't pushed to. I gave what I had. Someone else can carry the next part of it. But I think about the relay techs out there right now. Solo postings, long tour, the edge of the surveyed lanes. I think about what they carried with them when they went out. Whether they had their objects. Whether they had their margins filled with handwriting. Whether they knew, in the specific practical sense, that who they were extended beyond the inside of their own skulls and into everything they'd ever touched. Most of them won't need to know it. Most postings are just postings, dark and quiet and long but survivable, and what they ask of you is patience and competence and a tolerance for solitude, nothing more. But some of them are near something that's listening, and for those, I hope they brought what matters. I hope they kept the things from the people they love, and held those things regularly, and understood without being told that it wasn't sentiment, it was structure. The structure you need to remain yourself in the kind of dark, where the thing that wants what you are can reach through the hull without making a sound. Bring your father's cup. Bring the note from the woman you should have told the truth to. Bring the dented thermos and the worn-edged tools and the photographs with the bent corners. Bring all of it, more than you think you'll need. More than you think you have. You are larger than you know, more various, more distributed, more thoroughly present in the world than any other mind we've encountered in the surveyed space. That is not a comfort, it's a fact. Remember what you are, keep it in your hands. The cup is on my desk.